At the Nocturnist, we are careful to ensure that all stories comply with healthcare privacy laws. Details may have been changed to ensure patient confidentiality. All views expressed are those of the person speaking and not their employer.
You're listening to the Nocturnist Conversations. I'm Emily Silverman. Air is so essential to life that our lungs and our breath have occupied an exceptional place in mythology and literature across time and culture. Our lungs, more than any other organ in the body, connect us to the outside world and each other. My guest today, pulmonologist Michael Stephen, has thought about the lungs more than anyone I know. He's an assistant professor of medicine and director of the Adult Cystic Fibrosis Center at Thomas Jefferson University. And as a pulmonary and critical care doc, he's also been on the front lines of the COVID pandemic. Before our conversation, I asked Michael to read an excerpt from the prologue of his book, Breathtaking: What Our Lungs Teach Us About Our Origins, Ourselves, and Our Future. Here is Michael Stephen.
The lungs are a mysterious and even mystical organ. They are our connection to the atmosphere, the organ that extracts the life force we need to exist. We have acknowledged this power for centuries. The Hebrew word ruach literally means breath, but also means spirit of life. In the book of Job, the prophet's friend Elihu declares, "The Spirit of God has made me, and the breath of the Almighty gives me life." This same concept is embodied in the New Testament, where the Apostle John says that Jesus breathed on his disciples, giving them the Holy Spirit. The life-giving power of the breath is acknowledged very early in the Bible. In the second chapter of Genesis, line 7 reads, "The Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being." Ancient Egyptian cultures also recognized the importance of the breath, the evidence of which we see today in the many ancient statues that have had their noses broken off, but otherwise were left untouched. This defacement was no accident, but a deliberate act by conquering groups to take the life, in this case the breath of life, away from these icons. Ancient knowledge about the power of the lungs was not limited to the Western world. Buddhism and Hinduism were based on an understanding of the potency of the breath. According to these disciplines, studying and harnessing the breath was the only recognized way to nirvana. Thich Nhat Hanh, a Vietnamese Buddhist monk, summarizes this ancient philosophy well in his 1975 book, The Miracle of Mindfulness. Breath is the bridge which connects life to consciousness, which unites your body to your mind. The emphasis on the breath is not a thing of the past for Eastern religions. Breathing continues to occupy a central role in their teachings today. The Hindu name for the breath is prana, which, like the Western word ruach and Holy Spirit, is not just a word for air, but an acknowledgement of the breath as the ultimate life force. This knowledge is spreading back to the West through disciplines such as yoga and mindfulness, but also through techniques aimed at improving endurance and even intimacy. These practices demonstrate that the mind and the heart follow the lungs, not the other way around. Civilizations throughout history have equated the breath with the soul, using one term to refer to both. In ancient Egypt, it was ka; in Zulu, umoya; in ancient Greece, pneuma; in Hinduism, prana. In his 1653 Lectures on the Whole of Anatomy, William Harvey, the famous 17th century British physiologist, stated simply but profoundly, "Life and respiration are complementary. There is nothing living which does not breathe, nor anything breathing which does not live."
Thank you so much for reading that. I thought it was such a beautiful and poetic way to open this book about the lungs, and it's really a tour of the lungs, and I'm so excited to get into it a little bit. But before we do, I'd love to hear where you got the idea to write this.
I've been studying lung medicine for 25 years pretty intensely. It sort of becomes your life, and you get very much into it. I've also had a background in reading and writing. I was a history major in college. And with my interest in the lungs and my profession in the lungs, I saw that lung medicine was perhaps getting overlooked. We've seen an extraordinary increase in lung diseases in the past 50 years. Numerous crises, both acute and chronic, are upon us now, as we all know. And I thought word should get out about lung health, that the breath of life is a universal right. And I thought this book could help us bring some recognition to this organ that has generally been ignored, and ignored to our detriment, for the last 50 years.
You do mention in the book that the lungs are a neglected organ, not just in the medical world, but even in literature and art. You say things like the heart steals the spotlight in a lot of different song lyrics, and the brain, gets the cachet of consciousness, and the skin gets pampered, and, the reproductive system has the magnetism of sex and all of those things. And then there's breathing and the lungs, and it doesn't seem to get as much attention in pop culture, but also it sounds like in the circles of medicine when it comes to fundraising for research and things like that. Can you tell us more about that? Like, why do you think that is, especially since, as you so beautifully just described, breath is so central to life?
I think some of it goes back to the physiology. Lung medicine can be a little messy. It can be a little dirty. People don't like looking at mucus. They don't like looking at sputum. I think it goes back centuries as well, that we understand that a lot of diseases are passed from lung to lung, and there's been shame and there's been sin associated with these diseases, and tuberculosis is a huge one. So when somebody's coughing or making mucus, we have a tendency to take a step away from that person. And I think those scare genes have been implanted in us, and the source of a lot of infections has been traced back to the lungs. And so I think that's given us a hesitancy to talk about them and to talk about them in the open. And obviously, we're talking about them a lot these days with COVID-19. So I think there's been some shame built up over the centuries, especially in Western culture. We've also demonized smokers too. At this point, we know tobacco is bad, but, quitting smoking is not easy. We know this. But I think, to answer your question, over the centuries, it's been associated with infections. It's been associated with poor health. And, the beauty and the power of this miraculous organ haven't been talked about enough.
I think that's so true. And I love how when you begin this book, you really start at the beginning. Like, you start at the level of the universe and at the level of the earth forming and its atmosphere, and how for so long we had this thin atmosphere that was a soup of different gases. And then you talk about the great oxygenation event and how that changed everything for us. I thought that was such a wonderful way to enter into the conversation of breath and the lungs. Can you tell our audience what is the great oxygenation event and why is it so important?
A lot of people don't know this, but for the first few billion years, the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. There was absolutely no oxygen in the atmosphere. And the arrival of oxygen, it started to build up probably about 2 billion years ago, but it took, hundreds of millions of years to get deposited into rock so enough could get into the atmosphere. And then about 500 million years ago, we saw this steep increase in oxygen in the atmosphere, and it reached critical mass and critical levels so that life forms could then use it as an energy supplementation. And, as we all know from sort of basic biochemistry, or at least those of us in medicine, you can create 2 units of energy without oxygen for a molecule of carbohydrates, whereas you can get 36 out of it if you have oxygen. So it just radically changed everything on this planet. So all animals, all plants, pretty much all life forms use oxygen today. So about 500 million years ago, there was this huge increase of cyanobacterium, the initial oxygen-producing organisms, these blue-green algae. Oxygen, as an aside, it's a very strange molecule in that it has this yin and yang. We want to give it to people, but we know that giving too much oxygen to people, with pneumonias, over a level sort of 100, it becomes toxic to us. So it's a giver of life, but it also has this dark side as well, where it can start wreaking havoc in our bodies if there's too much of it. And the level is very narrow. And it's quite interesting when you look at sort of all species of animals, whether it's birds or humans or anything, we all keep this very, very similar level of oxygen in our blood. We have to exist in a very, very narrow range. And it sort of talks a little bit about the fragility of life.
I love that you mentioned the animal piece of this because the evolutionary biology section of this book was one of my favorite. I'm just thinking about, these bacteria evolving into multicellular organisms, evolving into fish, and how fish have gills, and how the gills are able to filter the water and extract the oxygen. Can you walk our audience through that process of how we transition from gills underwater to lungs on land?
It's a very fascinating moment, and because of that, biologists have studied it very intensely, this moment where our ancestors sort of emerged out of the ocean. There was this vast landmass, and there were a lot of plants developing, so there was a lot of resources there, and no life forms on land, but potential food sources. So the two things that the fish had to do were to develop a way to extract oxygen from the atmosphere. They had a way to extract it from water, but not from the atmosphere. And then they had to grow limbs for locomotion. And, probably, this is a guess, we don't know, but fish probably just started swallowing air. They just started gulping it down so they could remain out of the water for a period of time and, doing their business about the land near the ocean and then getting back into the ocean. And over time, hundreds of millions of years probably, the esophagus developed an outpouching, and that outpouching became our lungs. And whereas humans, we ventilate our lungs by expanding them, air comes in along with oxygen, gas exchange occurs, and then our lungs kind of deflate to let the oxygen out. Quite interestingly, some animals do it radically different than us. Like some insects just have a thin pipe and oxygen comes in just by osmosis. Birds have a radically different oxygen extraction and CO2 removal system from ours that separated out areas from ventilation and oxygenation. And that moment in time happened, some around 400 million years ago, and kind of an extraordinary event.
I want to switch gears a little bit because in this book, each chapter focuses on a different disease. So we learn about asthma, we learn about COPD, TB, ILD, ARDS. Of course, there's a lot in there about COVID-19. But the chapter that really captured me, and it went last, and I just sensed that it was the most personal to you, was the chapter about cystic fibrosis, CF. And so I wanted to ask you to share with us, I saw in your bio that you work in cystic fibrosis. How did you come to be working with this disease, with patients who have this disease, and why is CF so close to your heart?
It started during my fellowship at the University of Pennsylvania. I went to a single CF clinic, and I just fell in love with it from minute one. It's a little strange to say love at first sight when you're talking about a disease that produces tons of mucus and it's very hard to treat, but it was that. The patients, it's a genetic illness, so they're born with this. A lot of them have been struggling for many years by the time to get to me as an adult physician, and I just saw such tremendous courage, such tremendous belief in their physicians and themselves and the family. It's a multidisciplinary approach in the clinic, which I really loved. So very often I am not the most important person in the room. The nutritionist who sees them, if they're having weight issues or weight gain or too much weight loss traditionally in cystic fibrosis, then they're going to be the most important person during that visit. And, the visits stretch usually for over an hour. It's not running into a patient's room for 10 minutes and then running to the next patient. We get tremendous support from the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation to let our visits run as long as they need to. So I just saw so much courage in these people. That was sort of the main reason why I really found a home in cystic fibrosis. And it's a little scary for me to think about what I would be doing in medicine if I didn't have this disease. It's a very strong mission. And it's a small community. All the physicians generally know each other. There's a wonderful international meeting every year that we all go to. And of course, we've seen tremendous strides in the therapies. So I've just considered it an honor to be part of this community for the last 15 years. And from the first clinic onwards, I knew this is what I want to do for the rest of my life.
I'm really struck by what you said about how long the visits are. That's just so appealing. I know so many physicians these days are just really disillusioned by how short their patient visits are, whether it's primary care or other subspecialties, and even hospitalists who are asked to carry lists of, 20, 25 patients, and they simply don't have time to sit down and get to know their patients. The idea of sitting down with a patient for an hour with a multidisciplinary team, just from a professional standpoint, that sounds really, really appealing. And so I'm struck by that. And I loved how you walked us through the history of the disease. So before we knew it was a lung disease, we thought of it more as a gastrointestinal disease and as a disease of the pancreas. Can you just walk us through that a little bit? Like, where did this all start?
This disease, as we know it, really started recognition and treatment in 1940. It's really only entered the modern era in the last 60 or 70 years, which is quite extraordinary. And the amount of progress that's been made during this time has been quite amazing. The mutations of cystic fibrosis started in Europe. For whatever reason, this mutation in the protein which regulates chloride and water and salt became dysfunctional. Because of that, mucus builds up in the chest, but also in the pancreas. So most of these patients are born with a destroyed pancreas that doesn't secrete the enzymes we need to digest food. So traditionally, for hundreds of years, these babies would all basically starve to death. There's a famous quote, "Woe is the child who tastes salty on the skin, for he is hexed and shall soon die." That goes back to medieval times in Europe because salt was abnormal in these babies, and then the pancreas didn't work. And, the pathologists in Europe in the 19th century began noticing that this pancreas was very abnormal, but it wasn't tied to a lung disease until the 1930s, until this physician at Columbia, Dorothy Anderson, wrote this huge paper with about 50 patients in it and said, hey, everybody in the pediatric community needs to start looking for these people with abnormal pancreases and abnormal lungs. And once she sort of wrote it, it was almost like a screen dropping, and hundreds of cases were described, and it was like floodgates opening up. And it was recognized that this disease was out there, and the first treatments were for the pancreas to replace enzymes, and that made a huge difference right away. Lung disease generally happens over a much longer period, but if you can't absorb food, then obviously you're going to die very quickly, and those babies would die within the first few months. So with pancreatic enzymes in the 1940s, that was the first big increase in life expectancy that you saw.
Yeah, it was just really fascinating to me that they found a way to handle the GI aspect of the disease. And it wasn't until then that the patients started living long enough that we could see the ramifications in the lung. And, you just walk us through this narrative where we have Dr. Swee and Dr. Francis Collins, who really banded together and made this decision that they were going to discover the gene for cystic fibrosis. And they went out and they bought this bottle of whiskey and they put it up on the shelf and they said, we're going to open this bottle of whiskey when we find it. And then they found it, and then they did. And, it was 10 a.m. and they're drinking this whiskey. And then this other anecdote that I really, really loved, where you have the scientists who are trying to develop drugs that target proteins, and you have this guy standing at the front of the room giving kind of a boring PowerPoint presentation, and the businessman with the briefcase who has all the money gets bored and starts to get up and leave, and then the scientist panics and fast forwards to the very last slide of his presentation and sort of makes the big reveal, and then the guy drops his briefcase and ends up staying in the room and asking questions. And without that moment, we may not have gotten all of these protein modification drugs. And I loved the storytelling around the scientific discovery, and I couldn't help but think back to my medical school lecture about cystic fibrosis and how all of that knowledge was just taught to me in a vacuum, show up to lecture, they put up a slide and they say, today we're going to talk about CF. CF is caused by a mutation in the CFTR gene and blah, blah, blah. And they just present all this information without any of the history. And I was just wondering if you felt that there was a role for this kind of historical context in medical education, not just to make learning about these diseases more fun, but to help people remember things about how these diseases work?
I have thought about that a tremendous amount. Science is presented as something very dry, something formula-based. There absolutely needs to be sort of a broad base of understanding in mathematics and physics and biochemistry. But what's completely missing from the education is that as a scientist on a day-to-day basis, it takes just a tremendous amount of creativity to make these discoveries, to think of ideas, to follow up on them. Which data do I pick? We're talking about artificial intelligence. Well, I think that's going to fail because it just takes the data. There's some human intuition and observation. It's an extremely creative process, and that feeling of creativity is completely missing from how science is presented, what scientists do on a day-to-day basis, how often they fail. We don't tell that story either. So I think it would be a wonderful idea to introduce how storytelling is so important in science, how creativity is so important in science. And it's sort of presented in this very, very dry way. It turns off so many people. And it's also not how it's done. When I finally got into sort of the real world of science and I saw how messy it was, I was like, people have been lying to me here for 20 years of my life. Here I am struggling with all these different things and I have to come up with all these different ideas. This is not how I was sold science. It's a lot harder and takes a lot more creativity than people appreciate. I think if we introduce that sooner, that will bring out more talent, that will excite people more about these fields. I think it's extraordinarily important. As human beings, we're storytellers. That's how we learn.
Yeah, I wish I had this book when I was in my pulmonology block in medical school. I feel like reading this book alone, I probably would have learned much of what I needed to learn, at least about the pathophysiology, but about the treatment too. So for all the medical students out there listening, when your pulmonology block comes, pick up this book. It'll be probably much more interesting than whatever PowerPoint lecture you're being asked to memorize. Okay, so I wanted to keep up with this cystic fibrosis topic because I really, really felt your passion for it in the book. And there was this one moment that I just wanted to bring up and ask you maybe to talk more about. And it's the moment where we meet Sarah. So for the audience, Sarah is a little girl and she has cystic fibrosis and she needs a lung transplant and she can't get one because she's under 12. And there's all these convoluted laws about why children under 12 can't get a lung transplant in time before they die. And her mom goes on this advocacy rampage and takes things to court and ultimately prevails. And Sarah ends up getting her lung transplant, and then, hours later, the transplant fails, and then she gets a second transplant, and then that transplant takes. And you talk about how you were following this story and you were following this patient. I'm not sure if you were directly involved in her care or if you knew of this case more peripherally, but at this conference, you say around a year out from Sarah's transplant, she comes to the conference to get this award, and she makes this speech to the room. And so this little 11-year-old girl who has just survived 2 lung transplants for her cystic fibrosis makes this speech that really emotionally moved all of the physicians and all the scientists in the room. And I thought might be interesting for you to bring us into that moment a little bit.
That was an extraordinary moment. I was not involved in her care directly, but certainly followed it in the media. Traditionally in lung transplant, you just sort of picked a number and got on a waiting list, and if you managed to survive long enough to get lungs, then you got them. A couple hundred people still die every year on the lung transplant waiting list. There are just not enough organs in this country to go around. Through perseverance, through her family, through Sarah herself, along with a lot of other people, they were successful to get this rule changed that people just had to sort of stay in line for transplants, that there really wasn't an adjustment for level of illness. And then she sort of dropped out of the media, and then I go to this dinner and she's being honored. It was Valentine's Day. I remember this sort of huge sea of red dresses because it was Valentine's Day, and there were over 500 people in this auditorium. It was very loud, but when she got up to speak, you could hear a pin drop. She was in a wheelchair then, and she gave us this speech telling us that she had fight in her. She never gave up. It was a magical moment. It felt like you were seeing a miracle. There are mysteries in the world that you cannot totally understand. This little girl who went through so much and still had this extremely positive attitude, which was clearly the difference between life and death in her.
Yeah, I have some excerpts from the speech here where she says, God gave me bravery, that's why I survived, and all kids have that bravery inside of them. So look inside of yourself for that bravery. I promise it's there, and it will take you to the impossible if you believe in yourself. And I had to admit, I got emotional just reading it. I can't imagine what it must have been like to have been there.
Yeah, and she had a bunch of her friends, and they had all on these beautiful dresses, and they swarmed her after the speech. And needless to say, there was a long period of applause after she finished.
So as I mentioned, a lot of these chapters tackle different diseases of the lung, like TB and asthma and things like that. But there was a chapter that I just loved that was about breath as healing, breath as a healing force. You talk about how the breath is unique because it is one of those things that is under unconscious control, like the heartbeat or digestion. But we can also override it with our conscious control. And in the prologue, you have that wonderful quote about how the breath is this unique bridge from the conscious to the subconscious. So if you start with the breath, the subconscious and the mind and the body will follow. And I just had never thought of it that way. I thought that was so interesting. And I wondered if you could share with our audience some of your discoveries around how we can use the breath to heal ourselves.
We have to start thinking of the breath as medicine, of air as medicine, and we have to make sure that it's pure in that respect as well. I will say, we've had this understanding of the breath for thousands of years, and I think we've lost sight of that here in the West, certainly not in the East, with the concepts of prana, with the use of yoga and breath work that's been melded together, that the understanding that the only way to get to nirvana, a state of understanding is through breath work. And we're kind of pulling apart a lot of the science now. But yes, absolutely. Unlike the heart, we can't speed up the heart or slow down the heart consciously. Same with the kidneys. We can't make more urine or less urine, depending on what we want consciously. But we can work with our breath. And I think what happens with a lot of people is we get away from good natural breath work as we get older. Some of us put on weight. Some of us our muscles get a little weak. Some of us just hide a ton of stress in our shoulders. And I see this a lot. And we start breathing with the muscles of the neck and the muscles of the upper chest. And that leaves the good areas of your lung and the lower lobes where more of the blood flow goes because of gravity. And generally more of the airflow goes when we ventilate. It leaves those areas collapsed and ignored. And the body doesn't like that. And that sort of becomes a cycle of stress and dysfunctional breathing. So we have to engage our diaphragms more. We have to strengthen our lungs. There's just a tremendous amount of literature coming out that, asthma patients are able to cut down on inhaled steroid use with breath work. It's a medicine for PTSD, for depression, for lowering inflammatory markers in cancer patients. It just induces the parasympathetic system of our body so well with easy breath work, with diaphragmatic expansion. The vagus nerve of the parasympathetic system feeds back to the brain that all is well and good with the world, that this person is appropriately exchanging gas and they should be rewarded for it. There's just been more and more studies showing that appropriate breath work can be tremendously helpful.
Yeah, I mean, having gone through medical school myself, reading your book, it was an amazing book and so well written, but I was familiar with a lot of the concepts. For instance, I was familiar with CF and its genetic basis. I was familiar with TB. But when I got to this chapter, I thought, no one taught me this. No one taught me this in medical school. And it's just stunning to see, as you said, how breath work can reduce measured inflammation in the body. This example that you gave of vase breathing, of people who breathe a certain way and they're able to raise their body temperature, like sort of those magicians who submerge themselves in ice baths for like over an hour and somehow live to tell the tale. Like, it's just really powerful what we can do with the breath. And if you don't mind, I just wanted to share a brief anecdote with you, because what this chapter helped me understand is some of my own experiences. So when I was in residency, I had some surgery on my pelvic area and ended up having a really tight pelvic floor after that for a long time, and had to go to pelvic physical therapy and was having a lot of discomfort and a lot of symptoms from it. And the pelvic PT woman just kept telling me to do deep breathing practices. And I have to confess, I didn't really buy into it. I didn't believe it. I didn't think it would work. I just didn't understand what breathing had to do with my pelvic floor. And what it took for her to get me to believe was she had to hook up my pelvic muscles to a system where there were these sensors and they plugged into a graph, like into a computer screen. And then I would clench and relax my pelvic floor, and she showed me in real time this graph that showed the tone of my pelvic floor. And it was really, really high, really abnormal. And then she says, I want you to sit here and close your eyes and just do some really slow, deep breathing for, 30 seconds, 60 seconds. So I did. And when I opened my eyes, I could see evidence on this graph that my pelvic floor muscle tone had come down. It didn't come down to normal, but it went from, severe to moderate. And in a way, I'm kind of ashamed to say that that's what it took for me to believe. Like, I really had to see it to believe it. And I wonder why that is. Like, why is it that it was so difficult for me to understand how the breath was connected to other parts of my body?
Well, let me first say that's an amazing story. And I wish I had met you before I wrote the book, because that story would have gone in there, no question. It's so simple that it seems like it couldn't be true. I think that's part of it. And part of it, it's just not valued in our culture. We don't have this culture of yoga, of breathing, of Tai Chi, of moving easily. It's just not there. We're kind of a go, go, go society. You see these people at the gym, we're taught no pain, no gain. And we see these people sort of beating themselves up through exercise, where I would think 90% of them would feel better and get fitter if they just engaged in some breathing exercises and some movement through yoga or some other modality. So we're a culture that does not believe things come easily, that we need to go through tremendous pain to get anywhere, that breath work seems too easy to be true. I will comment, however, that breath work is not to be taken lightly either. We talk about these monks using breath work to stay outside of minus 20 degree temperature overnight with a thin sheet on, and they're able to do it through breath work. But these are the weightlifters who have been practicing for 20 years and are able to move, pump 300 pounds of iron. So it takes many years to get to that level, and you have to be careful with it because it is so powerful. So when I introduce breath work to my patients, I generally like to take it very slow. Close your eyes, close your mouth, take some easy breaths in for a couple minutes, a little bit longer in, hold it for a little bit and let it out, and just be aware of the breath. Don't do anything too crazy or to be turned off. We all want to be that weightlifter who is able to pump 300 pounds of iron right away. So I think, it's not encouraged in this country, and it's not talked about at a deep level. Another thing that, my wife is from Europe, and they have this tremendous sort of singing culture in the school that she went to, and they worked on the breath through this singing culture, and they all as part of this, she was taught growing up, put your hands on your belly and expand your diaphragm. That's how you learn to sing. That's how you learn to be well. And we just don't get any of that here in this country, that kind of understanding. So it's out there in other societies. We just need to talk about it more. We need to tell stories, like amazing stories like you just told. Certainly one of the most dramatic stories I've ever heard.
I'd love to talk about this idea that you bring up, and you touched on it at the beginning when you were talking about lung diseases as having stigma because we think of coughing as dirty and lung diseases as being transmissible. Is this idea of air being a communal thing, something that we share? It's invisible, but the atmosphere, it's this fluid thing. And if we could see it, we would see all of us breathing in and breathing out and all the dust swirling and everything. It's just invisible to us. So I was just wondering if you could say a few words about this idea that our air is communal and that the quality of the air matters. And how do you navigate those conversations as a lung doctor with your patients and also just as a writer and getting the word out about how important these environmental issues are?
As a lung doctor, and I think all lung doctors share this, and all doctors probably, that right to clean air and a clean breath is a universal right that we should work towards. And 91% of the world's population, including 45% here in America, are exposed to toxic levels of gas by World Health Organization standards. So we are not getting a healthy breath. 8 million people die prematurely each year throughout the globe because of pollution, both indoor and outdoor. And so for me, it is not a political issue. It's an issue of health. And we know further that, inhaling air affects not only our lungs, it causes osteoporosis, it causes cardiac disease, causes Alzheimer's disease. So lung diseases and poor air are total body diseases. And so I would say to medical school deans across the country that climate change needs to be taught in medical school. It needs to be part of the curriculum. We need to understand what is happening with our breath if we're going to take on these diseases and curb this extremely high increase in lung diseases that we've seen over the last 50 years. And there's no better example that's exposed these vulnerabilities than COVID-19. Talking about the communal issue of the air, we can't see it. And so there's skepticism about it, especially in this country. We all move 10,000 liters of air in and out of our chest, the amount of gallons of water in a medium-sized swimming pool, but we can't see it. So we don't talk about it, we don't think about it. That's not true in other countries. So you see in Asia people wearing masks when they have viruses, when the pollution levels are high or when allergy counts are high, or you see them wearing masks. And we don't have that culture here. And so one good thing about masks is it's made us think about the atmosphere more. And I don't want to see them go away completely. You can follow pollution levels now on your smartphone, and outdoor activities, you really shouldn't be doing them if there's very high levels of pollution in the air. We know that the atmosphere is connected in big ways too. The Sahara Desert feeds the Amazon rainforest. The dust from the Sahara Desert hitches a ride over the ocean on wind currents in the atmosphere and feeds the Amazon rainforest. So it's all connected. It's connected at a big level, like what I just described with dust movements, but it's connected at a very small level with viruses and COVID.
You mentioned COVID-19, and I want to ask you about it, although I'm not sure what to ask or how to ask it or what my question is. It's just been such a difficult year, and maybe the way I'll ask is this. As a lung doctor watching all of this unfold, what has it felt like for you? I know you've also done some clinical care of COVID patients. How did the COVID pandemic impact you personally, and how did it all look through your eyes?
In this country, at least on the East Coast, it sort of started in New York City and built up to tremendous numbers there. And then where I was in Philadelphia, sort of built up in April and May, and we all got pulled off of whatever duties we were on, outpatient or research, and it was all hands on deck. And it was a very scary time. There were a lot of people dying. We had no medicines. We had no understanding about the natural history of the disease. So, natural history being what happens where, what are some complications that we should expect and when with this disease. So everybody was flying blind. There was panic in the medical community too, and we sort of switched from the time-honored primum non nocere, first do no harm, and we switched to primum succurrere, hasten to help, and it was not a wise decision. I think every single medicine that we gave initially has shown to be non-beneficial or even harmful, and that goes back to hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin, and there were anti-worm drugs people were using, and there was no data for this. And we never did this in medicine before, and there was just total panic. But, it's understandable. Everybody was at great personal risk. Society was at risk for collapsing. Personally, at the end of May, I came down with COVID myself and became very ill at home, ended up in the hospital with pneumonia and blood clots. It was a very scary time for me and for my family. I passed it on to my wife, who has an underlying genetic illness, and my 2 young kids. So there was tremendous guilt on my part for bringing that home, for infecting them. Having your 9-year-old daughter have a fever of 104 and not be able to walk is not a fun thing. So I felt like I let them down. I felt like I had sinned. Illness felt like sin for me in that moment. Fortunately, everybody did well. We all recovered to 100%, and we can talk about a happy ending now, but it certainly left some scars. After that, I was very happy to get back into the hospital to take care of more COVID patients. It seems like the medications really helped. There was much more understanding about the natural history of disease, and things did get a lot better in the hospital for a period of time. Unfortunately, we're back on a huge upswing now, and another feeling of helplessness is descending upon us. But we will persevere. We will persevere. We will get through it. Everybody has banded together in the hospital. There's such an amazing community of nurses, of environmental workers, of phlebotomists. In all my time, in 6 months or 8 months of COVID, I never saw a schedule go unfilled. I never saw a lack of somebody showing up at any job. So there's just been great personal risk, but there's been great personal sacrifice. People sticking together, and I feel like I'm watching sort of the modern soldiers of D-Day here. There's just been an incredible lack of support at the federal level. It starts at the top, that we still can't get tests done in a brief fashion that we need to, and it's heartbreaking. And you see these cases, and it is truly heartbreaking. And there's going to be a lot of PTSD in the hospital when all is said and done. But for now, we're digging in. We're going to get through this. The vaccine is here. There's hope, and we're going to hold on to it, and we're going to get through this.
Thank you for coming onto the Nocturnist podcast to share your work with us and telling this amazing history of the lungs.
Thank you so much, Emily. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you.
So this is Michael Stevens' book, Breathtaking: The Power, Fragility, and Future of Our Extraordinary Lungs. And I highly recommend it to anybody listening. If you're not in healthcare, you will learn a ton about the lungs. If you are in healthcare, as you heard, there's a lot of topics in here that are not touched on in the traditional medical education curriculum, so you will still learn a ton. And medical students, read this book on your pulmonology rotation. It will be more fun, and you'll take so much away from it. I know I did. And thanks again, Michael.
Thank you so much, Emily.
That's our show. Tune in next week for another conversation with author Danielle Spencer about her book, Metanosis: Revelatory Narratives of Health and Identity. This episode of the Nocturnist Conversations was produced by me and Adelaide Papazolo. Thanks to J.B. Kamangian at Women's Audio Mission in San Francisco and Matt Weber at Gradwell House in New Jersey. Thanks also to executive producer Ali Block, head of story development Adelaide Papazolo, and director of operations Rebecca Groves. Our original music was composed by Yosef Monroe, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. The Nocturnist is made possible by the California Medical Association, the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, and people like you who have donated through our website and Patreon page. Thank you for supporting our work in storytelling. If you'd like to add your voice to one of our ongoing storytelling projects, visit our website at thenocturnist.com. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the show. I'm your host, Emily Silverman. See you next week.